Indeed. Well, it's time now for our political panel. Joining me today, Richard Power Sayeed, who's a former Labour official. Also joining me is Jason Reed, who is a political commentator. Very good to see both of you this afternoon.
Lovely to see you, David.
Right, let's start, shall we? First of all, of course, the race between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak continues apace. And we've seen this video from Rishi Sunak, obviously addressing, I think it was Tunbridge Wells, essentially saying that he started to put a plan into place to sort of redistribute money from urban inner cities to areas like that. And I just wonder what the response you had to that clip was. Let's just play the clip now.
To start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that. I made sure as Chancellor across government, not only do we increase local government funding.
So that was in Tunbridge Wells. Let's go to you first, Richard. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, in a way, you sort of think, well, this is an obvious example of Rishi Sunak being the entitled Tory that he is. He thinks he can get away with this kind of thing. But it's not just Rishi Sunak, is it? Like, a couple of days ago, Liz Truss was saying it would be a good idea to cut public sector pay for nurses and all those, and other people who are keeping us alive, just because they're not in London and the South East. Like, this is just what the Conservative Party is. They don't care about people like you and me and the people who are listening to this radio show. They care about their donors. They care about the billionaires who bankroll them. This is just what the Conservative Party is.
Isn't that a little harsh, Jason? The fact is that Rishi Sunak was obviously trying to get the votes from those members in that constituency of Tunbridge Wells. They may well feel they're not getting an adequate share of money.
I think that is a little bit harsh, and it's just a feature of the political system that we have. And of course, we're in this strange position right now where Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are campaigning for the votes of a very small and very particular section of the British population, knowing full well that they, if they are successful, will have to win the votes of the country at large in just a couple of years' time. And that's a really difficult tightrope to balance, because often the things you want to say to the Tory party membership might be the opposite of the things you want to say to the country at large. Now, it does seem ill-advised in the extreme, shall we say, for Rishi Sunak to have said what he said and proposed a policy like that. It does seem like the exact opposite of levelling up. But I think Richard's criticism about being in hock to donors rather than caring about what people think isn't right at all. If anything, the criticism you would level at government is that they're maybe too concerned with polls and with dips and peaks and troughs in the polls and where public opinion is lying, rather than with the effectiveness of policy. And the Liz Truss scandal with the public pay boards was, I think, a perfect example of that. We never really were able to examine the detail of that policy and have a proper discussion about it because of the kind of response that Richard just gave, which is, it's just Tories who want to take money away from doctors and teachers because they don't like them, and that's the end of it. We don't have any more detail than that.
I mean, Richard, it's a really good point, actually, Jason makes. The point is that we do have London waiting. It is more expensive in the capital, and I think Liz Truss sort of verbalised what might be a policy worth looking at. I did find it very weird timing, though.
I mean, you guys seem to be suggesting that it's okay for politicians to lie during their leadership competition.
Why do you say that? Why did you use the word lie?
Because you both were talking about how they would say one thing to their leadership competition electors and then say something different.
No, it doesn't mean they're lying. It means that they're conveying different messages to different audiences.
Yeah. Okay, not lying, just being totally disingenuous for the sake of trying to give people an incorrect apprehension of what they do in government. Great, fine. Not lying, just being dishonest.
No, it's not being dishonest. It's not being dishonest. It's tailoring your message, isn't it?
I mean, you seem to be suggesting that this wouldn't actually be his policy in government. It's just something he was saying to the people.
I'm not saying that at all, Richard.
Incredibly wealthy Kentish town.
No, well, that is also not fair. We had a caller earlier saying that actually it isn't fair because there are pockets of wealth. Of course there are, but there are also pockets of poverty amongst the South East.
I mean, he wasn't talking about the South East.
No, but there are. There are pockets of poverty.
Yeah, sure. And nobody's denying that. They're saying that it's very important that money broadly goes into, the most deprived parts of our country. And that's what those funding formulas that were created by the Labour Party did. Rishi Sunak got rid of them because he wanted money to go into the areas where wealthy Tory voters live. What a surprise. That's the party that's in government right now.
Jason,
normal people.
I was going to say, Jason, I live in the east of England. Many people in the east of England feel they don't get a fair amount of money. They feel it's always pushed into industrial areas, into cities. And the east of England also has poverty, and it's often not given that kind of money.
Yeah, I think this levelling up debate is often much simpler than it should be when you actually look at the complexities of the way Britain works. It's not the case that the south is rich and the north is poor, and the more you send up north, the less money the south has, or anything like that. There's a lot of poverty in the southwest, for example. There's a lot of nuances going on. Now, clearly, the way that Rishi Sunak framed the policy is unhelpful, and he has, in fact, his campaign has rode back from it, perhaps unsurprisingly. And the levelling up policy of the government has almost become a cliche because we hear a lot of talk about levelling up, but not much detail on what that actually means. It used to be called the Northern Powerhouse. It's gone through various iterations because it's not easy at all to actually redistribute resources in a way that is helpful and in the way that allows growth in growth-deprived areas without taking away unfairly or unnecessarily from other areas as well. And that's a question that the next Prime Minister will have to answer. But I think it's easy, perhaps, for people like Richard, who are on the other side of the debate and not in government, to point and say, well, you should just do a better job of it. There are no easy answers to that very complex
Well,
question.
talking about the next Prime Minister, Richard, clearly we've got a situation, according to the polls, where you've got Liz Truss on 58%, Rishi Sunak on 26%. Do you think it's time for Rishi Sunak to say, OK, I actually withdraw from this contest?
I think if I thought there was any chance of them doing what was necessary to deal with people's bills going through the roof, then I'd say yes, let's try to end this competition sooner. But I mean, they've both absolutely refused to offer anything substantial in terms of that kind of policy. People are going to be freezing to death this winter because of that failure on Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak's part, and far more are going to obviously spend their days in the local library to keep warm. Far more will depend on food banks so they can turn one radiator on for a couple of hours on the cold evenings. My hope is that the competition going on for so long, kind of hypothetically, it would mean that they eventually start competing over that policy area. Yeah. But if you believe that, then you're pretty naive.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that's true. Very quickly, Jason, what's your response? Should Rishi Sunak stand aside?
No, he shouldn't stand aside. It's right that Tory party members have the chance to elect their new leader. We had a coronation with Theresa May back in 2016, and that wasn't a desirable situation. A lot can happen in a month. We do have a whole month left before the announcement of the next Prime Minister. A lot can happen in that time. I think it's unfair to criticise leadership candidates for not giving enough policy detail. Clearly, this campaign trail is not the place to be detailing policies like that. It's the place to set out a future direction for the country, and it's right that Tory party voters will get to vote on which direction and which vision they support the most.
Richard and Jason, thank you very much indeed. Stay where you are. It's time to take a short break. This is TalkTV. Let's move on now to the Bank of England, Jason. I said this yesterday. My feeling is the Bank of England has one main job. That's to keep inflation at 2%. They have failed miserably. It is now at 9.4%. It's now due to go up to 13%. Has the Bank of England been asleep at the wheel? Is it in a coma?
I'm afraid it has. I think the criticism of the Bank of England as being asleep at the wheel is absolutely on the money. It's pretty clear they should have raised interest rates quite a lot sooner. It's pretty clear they should have seen the inflationary crisis coming. Lots of economists saw coming, but for some reason they had blinkers on, and it's incredible. We've got to the point where in recent weeks during political discourse, especially in the Tory leadership contest, we've had to ask questions about the independence of the Bank of England. That's a really worrying point to have got to, that they've done their job so badly, they failed to do the one thing they were supposed to do, that we are looking at our options and thinking, what on earth can we do to correct this now?
And Richard, I assume your answer would be to renationalise the Bank of England, or at least to take it away from its own independent control.
It was nationalised in 1945 and it continues to be, so I'm glad to say.
I mean, it is independent. It was declared independent in 97, I think.
Indeed. Independence under Gordon Brown. What is wrong...
So a Labour policy?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So you
What
do
is
like
wrong-
independence for some institutions, but not others?
It's public ownership that I'm keen on. Independence is a very different thing. What is wrong about what the bank has been doing is it's been saying that workers shouldn't be asking for pay rises, and indeed the two contenders to be Prime Minister have been saying the same thing. I mean, it's just it's nonsense, right? In the last 3 months, not last 3 months, February to April, real wages fell by 2%, more than 2%. So clearly wages are not the thing that's causing inflation, right? And clearly this government doesn't think so either, because they just abolished the cap on bankers' bonuses. Profits have gone through the roof for the biggest corporations. That's just a fact. And that's what's causing about 60% of inflation. It's just a fact. The energy companies that we were talking about before, water, but the energy companies are the extreme example of that. They're making billions in profits from prices going up. They're also making billions in profits from market trading, speculation. But rather than control that, which, the government could be doing, the leadership contenders could be promising to do, they are literally telling us we shouldn't ask for our wages not to be cut. They're even saying they will take away our rights, our union rights, which is the only way that we could force our bosses to make our wages keep up with inflation.
I don't think they are saying that. They're saying they want to raise the threshold at which strikes are called. Also, Jason...
That's literally cutting our union rights. That's literally cutting
No, it is changing the mandate, the mandate that you need to ensure that you have industrial action, because at the end of the day, it is the public that always suffers. Jason, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think you make a very good point, David. I think you're conflating two different things, Richard, which is asking for a pay rise and going on strike. I've certainly not heard Liz Truss or anyone in her campaign or on her side of the Tory party saying that workers shouldn't be asking for a pay rise. I agree with you. It's
public sector workers aren't allowed to have a pay rise. You just made it up.
Public sector workers have been offered some of the most generous pay rises they've had in recent decades, and quite rightly so, given the crisis that we're in.
No.
Everyone is getting a real
let Jason finish
because of the inflationary crisis. Public sector workers have been offered some of the most generous pay rises in recent decades, and quite rightly so, given the crisis that we're in. Everyone's going to get a real terms pay cut effectively because of the inflationary crisis. That doesn't mean that we should have short-sighted, disproportionate pay rises in the public sector that come out of the rest of our pockets, because where does that money come from? It comes from our taxes, and taxing working people more is not a solution to a cost of living crisis.
I would also add into that, of course, many in the private sector have not had those kind of increases that have been offered to the public sector, Richard.
And do you know how they could have those pay increases? It's if they had more union density, if more people were members of the union. We heard from Jason just now that apparently there's a difference between getting a pay rise and having powerful unions who are able to go on strike. No, there isn't. If I go up to my boss and I say, give me a pay rise, my boss can just say no. If me and everyone else in my office go up to the boss and say, we won't work tomorrow if you don't give us a pay rise, he has to listen, or she has to listen. That's what the power of a union is. And I would say to everyone listening to this, if you want a pay rise, join a union tomorrow.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Thank you very much indeed to you, Jason, as well. That's Richard Power Sayeed and also Jason Reed. Richard is a former Labour official and Jason is a political commentator.